Now, the next thing I want to dive into is the relationship between entities, and I'm going to start with the most common one, the one-to-many relationship. Now, let's take a look at our two entities being movie and genre. For simplicity's sake, let's assume that a movie belongs to a single genre. If we were to draw that relationship logically, we would have a single genre for a movie, and a genre can be the genre of multiple movies. Now, if we would look at what that looks like in the database, that means that in the genre table, we have a primary key column that defines that entity. We would have a foreign key column in the movie table, and that foreign key would actually hold the value of the genre of this movie that it's pointing to. Now, this is nothing new, and if you're a little bit familiar with relational databases, you've seen this before. Now, let's hop into code and see how we model this one-to-many relationship there. Now, we do the same thing as what we would do in the database. We go to the many side of the relationship, in our case the movie entity, and we're going to point at the one side of the relationship, the genre entity. So I'm just going to create a property here, and that is going to be of the type genre, and I'm going to call it genre as well. Now, this is enough for Entity Framework to figure out that we want a one-to-many relationship between those two entities. So now that we go into the database, we can see that some things have changed. If we look at our genre table, everything is still identical. We have an ID and a name. If we go into the pictures table, we see that we now have an extra column called genre ID. We have also gotten a foreign key here, and that foreign key is actually a definition of exactly what we tried to do. We have the genre ID field on the pictures table pointing at the ID column on the genres table. That is exactly the way that we wanted to define this relationship. But there is so much more that we can do on the code side. Because this is just one navigation property from one entity to the next, we can also make that foreign key explicit in our model if we like. So if I add a property right next to it, that I'm going to give the type integer because that's what the primary key of genre is, and I just call it genre ID, then Entity Framework will figure out that these two belong together because this is the name of the entity above plus ID, so that works out just fine. Now, also on the many side, we can define a navigation property as well that allows us to query all of the movies that have the same genre. So if I create that navigation property here and I say iCollection of movie, which is all my movies, and I'm going to call that one movies, and I set that to a hash set of movie. Obviously, I'm missing a new keyword there. That solves the navigation property in the other direction as well. We now have a proper navigation property in two directions. But for Entity Framework, that doesn't change anything. If we would rerun it now, our data model would still look the same because Entity Framework figures out that all these things belong together and they're all talking about the same one-to-many relationship. It's because now I have followed the conventions, but sometimes you don't really follow conventions. So let's go into the movie entity. And obviously, a movie can have multiple genres, and there is always a main genre. So let's assume that this in the database should be called main genre ID and not just genre. So that means that we now have a navigation property that doesn't really match with what is going on here. So if I run this now, what we will see is Entity Framework will not put the one and one together, and we will actually end up with a genre ID and a main genre ID. And the genre ID will be the foreign key, and the main genre ID will have nothing to do with this entity. So if I now refresh these columns, what you will see is we have a main genre ID, not a foreign key. Genre ID is a foreign key. So if we want to put all of this together, we're going to have to go into our Fluent API again to rectify this. Whenever we don't follow conventions, that's what we need to do. So let's go into movie mapping and actually solve this problem once and for all. Now in the builder, we can easily define foreign key relationships and any one-to-many very easily. So builder, in this case, we are going to do this in a couple of steps. We are on the movie entity and the movie has one genre. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say exactly that, has one genre. And we can now pass either the name of the property or the type of other entity, but the easiest way to do this again is use the lambda expression. So I'm going to say movie.genre. Now we're going to define the other direction of the relationship because it doesn't know if this is a one-to-one or a one-to-many just yet. So I'm going to say with many, and that would be enough if we don't have the navigation property in the other direction. But you can also define the navigation property in the other direction just here. So I can say genre. The way that we point back to our movies is genre.movies. And that works just fine. So now we have defined the two navigation properties. Now we still need to link in that primary key and that foreign key. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to point to the has principal key, which is how we define which key we're going to point to on the one side of the relationship, because we are not always using the primary key. Sometimes you want to use an alternate key as well. So on the genre entity, I'm going to say that I'm going to use the primary key in this case, like so. Anything you select here needs to be a defined unique identifier for that entity, or this will not work. And then I'm going to say I'm going to define my foreign key, so has foreign key. And that is, of course, on my movie entity, and that is that movie.main_genre_id. So that is the full definition in Fluent API of a one-to-many relationship. Now, a lot of the stuff that I have typed here you would not need, mainly all of this. If you would just define the genre, that would be enough. But this is how you piece everything together if you don't really want to follow the conventions or if you need to deviate for whatever reason. So this works just fine. And if we run this now, the only thing that we will see change is that genre ID will disappear and the main genre ID will become our foreign key in our database. So let's take a look into Azure Data Studio and see what happened to our columns. And obviously, as expected, that genre ID has disappeared. This is now the foreign key. That means that if I refresh my foreign keys and I take a look at what that does now, I haven't properly refreshed this. Now it's refreshed. You will see that it is now called main genre ID and that is pointing at the ID in the genres table, exactly as expected. Now, before we move on, and I'm going to show you what you can do with all of this in code, there is one thing that I want to take care of. I want to have some data to work with. And for that, I'm going to show you another entity framework feature really quickly in between. Now, if we want to have data to work with and we don't always want to recreate it every time our database gets recreated, if there's data that needs to be always there, you can use something called a seed. So as I just typed, this is data that needs to be created always. So in this case, we can do builder.hasData, and that is how we can insert some data into this table, which is fantastic. If I were to put a movie entity in here, that would work just fine, and that would get created every run of the application. See that I'm also pointing to main genre ID 1, which is why I already provided the genre mapping class for this lesson. I'm gonna create the genre there. If we now run this, we will get a database with a little bit of data already inserted into it. That will make the rest of this lesson a lot easier to do because we can run and destroy the database at will. So if I now query this and I take a look at what we're getting, I see that we are getting the Fight Club movie and we do get a main genre ID, but I don't see the actual genre here. Now, if we want to make that happen, we're going to have to go back into our code and where we make the actual query. So let's go into our movies controller and look at that get method that fetches that single entity. And what we see here is we see the single or default async. And if I want to add that extra entity in there, I'm going to have to fetch it explicitly. And that is one of the things that has changed between Entity Framework and Entity Framework Core. Entity Framework Core doesn't have lazy loading by default anymore. So anything we want to fetch, we have to explicitly fetch. Because if Entity Framework would fetch everything when we access it, we would end up making a lot of round trips to our database engine, which we don't want. So all I'm going to do here is do an include, and include has a couple of signatures, but obviously it has one with a lambda as well. So I can just go movie.genre, and that is the method that I want to use to actually fetch my genre along with my movies. Now let's see what happens here, because something is going to go wrong, and that is something you'll definitely run into at some point. So I figured I'll quickly show you. It's more of an ASP.NET problem than it is an Entity Framework problem. Now what Entity Framework does is it has this method, and I'm going to put a breakpoint right here so that I can show you what goes wrong. Now when we call that method to fetch a single movie by its ID, what happens is when we run this, we get exactly the object that we expected. We now have a movie object that has the genre set to it. But the problem is here, because we have a navigation property in the other direction, Entity Framework tries to link as many things together as it can. So on this genre, we already have that one movie that has been added to the movies property. So we basically have movies that has a movie that has a genre that has movies that has a movie that has a genre, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So what will happen is ASP.NET will try to serialize this, and it will run into that exact problem. So let's make that happen, shall we? Let's take a look at the exception that we're getting here, and it's definitely a possible object cycle was detected. So whenever you expose models to the outside world, figure out in which direction you want to make them visible and ignore the other part. Either not add it to your external model or JSON ignore it where you need to. So we are going to do that really quickly. To break that loop, we're just going to make sure that on the genre we never serialize all of the movies. So all we need to do is add a JSON ignore there, which is in the system text JSON serialization namespace. That will make sure that we never serialize this one. I'm still fetching the same entity. So this is going to do exactly the same thing when I run this with ID 1. I'm going to show you that in just a sec. Now, if I run this same query here, the one that failed a minute ago, let's execute that exactly the same. I'm getting exactly the same. Let's take a look at this movie. I still have those movies. We can still click all the way down if we want to. But it's going to stop serialization here because it's not going to take that movie into account. So if we now continue and we take a look at the output that we're getting a lot closer to what we actually wanted to see, which is now a movie with a genre, and that is all that we want to do with this relation. So that is how you define one-to-many relationships and how you use them. Now we can still query in the other direction. So if I were to add the include movies on the genre, I would still get them, but at the moment I'm not serializing them to the outside world. So I hope that makes the one-to-many relationships clear. Let's dive into the next chapter.